Flemington by Violet Jacob. Chapter 1. Prologue. Mr. Duthie walked up the hill with the gurgle of the burn he had just crossed purring in his ears. The road was narrow and muddy, and the house of Ardguys for which he was making stood a little way in front of him, looking across the dip threaded by the water. The tall white walls, discoloured by damp and crowned by their steep roof, glimmered through the ash trees on the bank at his right hand. There was something distasteful to the reverend man's decent mind in this homely approach to the mansion inhabited by the lady he was on his way to visit, and he found the remoteness of this byway among the grazing lands of Angus oppressive. The Kilpie burn, travelling to the river Isla further west, had pushed its way through the undulations of pasture that gave this particular tract, lying north of the Sidlaws, a definite character, and the formation of the land seemed to suggest that some vast groundswell had taken place in the earth, to be arrested suddenly in its heaving for all time. Thus it was that a stranger wandering about might come unwarily upon little outlying farms and cottages hidden in the trough of these terrestrial waves, and find himself, when he least awaited it, with his feet on a level with some humble roof, snug in a fold of the braes. It was in one of the largest of these miniature valleys that the house of Ardguys stood, with the Kilpie burn running at the bottom of its sloping garden. Mr. Duthie was not a stranger, but he did not admire the unexpected. He disliked the approach to Ardguys, for his sense of suitability was great. Indeed, it was its greatness which was driving him on his present errand. He had no gifts except the quality of decency, which is a gift like any other, and he was apt, in the company of Madam Flemington, to whose presence he was now hastening, to be made aware of the great inconvenience of his shortcomings, and the still greater inconvenience of his advantage. He crossed the piece of uneven turf dividing the house from the road, and ascended the short flight of stone steps, a spare black figure in a three-cornered hat, to knock with no uncertain hand upon the door. His one great quality was staying him up. Like the rest of his compeers in the first half of the 1700s, Mr. Duthie wore garments of rusty blue or grey during the week, but for this occasion he had plunged his ungainly arms and legs into the black which he generally kept for the Sabbath day, though the change gave him little distinction. He was a homely and very uncultured person, and while the approaching middle of the century was bringing a marked improvement to country ministers as a class, mentally and socially he had stood still. He was ushered into a small panelled room in which he waited alone for a few minutes, his hat on his knee. Then there was a movement outside, and a lady came in, whose appearance let loose upon him all those devils of apprehension which had hovered about him as he made his way from his manse to the chair on which he sat. He rose, stricken yet resolute, with the cold, forlorn courage which is the bravest thing in the world. As Madam Flemington entered, she took possession of the room to the exclusion of everything else, and the minister felt as if he had no right to exist. Her eyes, meeting his, reflected the idea. Christian Flemington carried with her that atmosphere which enwraps a woman who has been much courted by men, and though she was just over 42 and a grandmother, the most inexperienced observer might know how strongly the fires of life were burning in her still. An experienced one would be led to think of all kinds of disturbing subjects by her mere presence: intrigue, love, power, 1,000 abstract yet stirring things, far, far remote from the weather-beaten house which was the incongruous shell of this compelling personality. Dignity was hers in an almost appalling degree, but it was a quality unlike the vulgar conception of it, a dignity which could be all things besides distant, unscrupulous in its uses, at times rather brutal, outspoken, even jovial, born of absolute fearlessness, and conveying the certainty that its possessor would speak and act as she chose, because she regarded encroachment as impossible, and had the power of cutting the bridge between herself and humanity at will. That power was hers to use and to abuse, and she was accustomed to do both. In speech, she could have a plain coarseness which has nothing to do with vulgarity, and is, indeed, scarcely compatible with it. A coarseness which is disappearing from the world in company with many better and worse things. She moved slowly, for she was a large woman, and had never been an active one. But the bold and steady brilliance of her eyes, which the years had not faded, suggested swift and sudden action in a way that was disconcerting. She had the short, straight nose common to feline types, and time, which had spared her eyes, was duplicating her chin. Her eyebrows, even and black, accentuated the heavy silver of her abundant, unpowdered hair, which had turned color early, and an immense ruby hung from each of her tiny ears in a setting of small diamonds. Mr. Duthie, who noticed none of these things particularly, was, nevertheless, crushed by their general combination. It was 9 years before this story opens that Christian Flemington had left France to take up her abode on the small estate of Ardguys, which had been left to her by a distant relation. Whilst still almost a child, she had married a man much older than herself, and her whole wedded life had been spent at the court of James II. Of England, at Saint Germain, whither her husband, a Scottish gentleman of good birth in the exiled king's suite, had followed his master, remaining after his death in attendance upon his widow, Mary Beatrice of Modena. Flemington did not long survive the king. He left his wife with one son, who, on reaching manhood, estranged himself from his mother by an undesirable marriage. Indeed, it was immediately after this latter event that Christian quitted her post at court, retiring to Rouen, where she lived until the possession of Ardguys, which she inherited a few months later, gave her a home of her own. Different stories were afloat concerning her departure. Many people said that she had gambled away the greater part of her small fortune and was forced to retrench in some quiet place. Others that she had quarrelled with and been dismissed by Mary Beatrice. Others again declared that she had been paid too much attention by the young Chevalier de St. George and had found it discreet to take herself out of his way. But the believers in this last theory were laughed to scorn, not because the world saw anything strange in the Chevalier's alleged infatuation, but because it was quite sure that Christian Flemington would have acted very differently in the circumstances. But no one could be certain of the truth. The one certain thing was that she was gone, and that since her retreat to Rouen she had openly professed Whig sympathies. She'd been settled at Ardguys, where she kept her political leanings strictly to herself, for some little time, when news came that smallpox had carried off her son and his undesirable wife, and as a consequence their little boy was sent home to the care of his Whig grandmother, much against the will of those Jacobites at the court of Saint Germain who were still interested in the family. But as nobody's objection was strong enough to affect his pocket, the child departed. Madame Flemington, as she was called by her few neighbours, was in correspondence with none of her old friends, and none of these had the least idea what she felt about her loss, or about the prospect of the child's arrival. She was his natural guardian, and though so many shook their heads at the notion of his being brought up by a rank Whig, no one was prepared to relieve her of her responsibility. Only Mary Beatrice, mindful of the elder Flemington's faithful services to James, granted a small pension for the boy's upbringing from her meagre private purse. But as this was refused by Christian, the matter ended. And now, in the year of grace 1727, young Archie Flemington was a boy of 8. and the living cause of the Reverend William Duthie's present predicament. Madam Flemington and the minister sat opposite to each other, silent. He was evidently trying to make a beginning of his business, but his companion was not in a mood to help him. He was a person who wearied her, and she hated red hair, besides which he was an Episcopalian and out of sympathy with himself and his community. She found him common and limited, and, at the present moment, intrusive. "It's my pleasure I have in coming to Ardguys the day," he began, and then stopped, because her eyes paralyzed his tongue. "You are no flatterer," said she, but the contempt in her voice braced him. "Indeed, that I am not, madam," he replied. "Neither shall it be said of me that I gang back from my duty. Nane shall assail nor make a mock of the kirk while I am its minister." "Who has made a mock of the kirk, my good man?" "Archie." The vision of her 8-year-old grandson going forth like a young David to war against the Presbyterian stronghold brought back Madam Flemington's good humour. "Ye may smile, madam," said Duthie, plunged deeper into the vernacular by agitation. "Ay, ye may laugh, but it ill beseems the grey hair on your pow." Irony always pleased her, and she laughed outright, showing her strong white teeth. It was not only Archie and the kirk that amused her, but the whimsical turn of her own fate which had made her hear such an argument from a man. It was not thus that men had approached her in the old days. "You are no flatterer, Mr. Duthie, as I said before." He looked at her with uncomprehending eyes. A shout, as of a boy playing outside, came through the window, and a bunch of cattle upon the slope cantered by, with their tails in the air. Evidently somebody was chasing them. "Let me hear about Archie," said the lady, recalled to the main point by the sight. "Madam, I would wish that ye could step west to the manse with me and see the evil abomination at my gate. It would gar ye blush." "I am obliged to you, sir. I had not thought to be put to that necessity by one of your cloth." "Madam?" "Go on, Mr. Duthie. I can blush without going to the manse for it." "An evil image has been set up upon my gate," he continued, raising his voice as though to cry down her levity. "An idolatrous picture. I think shame that the weans ganging by to the shule should see it, but I rejoice that there's mony o' them doesn't ken what it is." "Fie, Mr. Duthie! Is it Venus?" "It has idolatrous garments," continued he, with the loud monotony of one shouting against a tempest, "and a muckle crown on its head." "Then it is not Venus," observed she. "Venus goes stripped." "It is the Pope of Rome," went on Mr. Duthie. "I kent him when I saw the gaudy claes of him and the heathen vanities on his pow. I kent it was himself, and it was written at the foot o' him forby that. Ay, madam, there was writing too. There was a muckle bag out frae his mouth with wicked words on it. Come awa' to Babylon wi' me, Mr. Duthie. I garred the beetle run for water and a clout, for I could not thole that sic a thing should be seen." "And you left the Pope?" said Madam Flemington. "I did," replied the minister. "I would wish to let ye see to what like misuse Archie has put his talents." "And how do you know it was Archie's work?" "There's naebody hereabouts but Archie could have made sic a thing. The beadle tell't me that he saw him sitting ahint the whins wi' his box o' paint as he gaed down the manse road, and syne when he came back the image was there." As he finished his sentence the door opened, and a small figure was arrested on the threshold by the sight of him. The little boy paused, disconcerted and staring, and a faint colour rose in his olive face. Then his glum look changed to a smile in which roguery, misgiving, and an intense malicious joy were blended. He looked from one to the other. "Archie, come in and make your reverence to Mr. Duthie," said Madam Flemington, who had all at once relapsed into punctiliousness. Archie obeyed. His skin and his dark eyes hinted at his mother's French blood, but his bow made it a certainty. The minister offered no acknowledgment. If Archie had any doubt about the reason of Mr. Duthie's visit, it did not last long. The minister was not a very stern man in daily life, but now the Pope and Madam Flemington between them had goaded him off his normal peaceable path, and his expression bade the little boy prepare for the inevitable. Archie reflected that his grandmother was a disciplinarian, and his mind went to a cupboard in the attics where she kept a cane. But the strain of childish philosophy which ran through his volatile nature was of a practical kind, and it reminded him that he must pay for his pleasures, and that sometimes they were worth the expense. Even in the grip of Nemesis, he was not altogether sorry that he had drawn that picture. Madam Flemington said nothing, and Mr. Duthie beckoned to him to come nearer. "Child," said he, "you have put an affront upon the whole of the folk of this parish. You have raised up an image to be a scandal to the passers-by. You have set up a notorious thing in our midst, and you have caused words to issue from its mouth that the very kirk officer, when he dicked it out with his clout, thought shame to look upon. I have jaloused it right to complain to your grandmother and to warn her that she may check you before you bring disgrace and dismay upon her and upon her house." Archie's eyes had grown rounder as he listened, for the pomp of the high-sounding words impressed him with a sense of importance, and he was rather astonished to find that any deed of his own could produce such an effect. He contemplated the minister with a curious detachment that belonged to himself. Then he turned to look at his grandmother, and, though her face betrayed no encouragement, the subtle smile he had worn when he stood at the door appeared for a moment upon his lips. Mr. Duthie saw it. Madam Flemington had not urged one word in defence of the culprit, but, rightly or wrongly, he scented lack of sympathy with his errand. He turned upon her. "I charge you, nay, I demand it of you," he exclaimed, "that you root out the evil in yon bairn's nature. Tak awa from him the foolish toy that he has put to sic a vile use. I will require of you." "Sir," said Madam Flemington, rising, "I have need of nobody to teach me how to correct my grandson. I am obliged to you for your visit, but I will not detain you any longer." And almost before he realized what had happened, Mr. Duthie found himself once more upon the stone steps of Ardguys. Archie and his grandmother were left together in the panelled room. Perhaps the boy's hopes were raised by the abrupt departure of his accuser. He glanced tentatively at her. "You will not take away my box?" he inquired. "No." "Mr. Duthie has a face like this," he said airily, drawing his small features into a really brilliant imitation of the minister. The answer was hardly what he expected. "Go up to the cupboard and fetch me the cane," said Madam Flemington. It was a short time later when Archie, rather sore, but still comforted by his philosophy, sat among the boughs of a tree farther up the hill. It was a favourite spot of his, for he could look down through the light foliage over the roof of Ardguys and the Kilpie burn to the rough road ascending beyond them. The figure of the retreating Mr. Duthie had almost reached the top and was about to be lost in the whin patch across the strath. The little boy's eyes followed him between the yellowing leaves of the tree which autumn was turning into the clear-tinted ghost of itself. He had not escaped justice, and the marks of tears were on his face, but they were not rancorous tears, whose traces live in the heart long after the outward sign of their fall has gone. They were tears forced from him by passing stress, and their sources were shallow. Madam Flemington could deal out punishment thoroughly, but she was not one of those who burn its raw wounds with sour words, and her grandson had not that woeful sense of estrangement which is the lot of many children when disciplined by those they love. Archie adored his grandmother, and the gap of years between them was bridged for him by his instinctive and deep admiration. She was no companion to him, but she was a deity, and he had never dreamed of investing her with those dull attributes which the young will tack on to those who are much their seniors, whether they possess them or not. Mr. Duthie, who had just reached middle life, seemed a much older person to Archie. He felt in his pocket for the dilapidated box which held his chief treasures, those dirty lumps of paint with which he could do such surprising things. No, there was not very much black left, and he must contrive to get some more, for the adornment of the other manse gate-post was in his mind. He would need a great deal of black, because this time his subject would be the devil, and there should be the same, or very nearly the same, invitation to the minister. End of chapter 1. Prologue. Flemington by Violet Jacob. Chapter 2. Jetsam. 18 years after the last vestige of Archie's handiwork had vanished under the beetle's clout, two gentlemen were sitting in the library of a square stone mansion at the eastern end of the county of Angus. It was evening, and they had drawn their chairs up to a fireplace, in which the flames danced between great hobs of polished brass, shooting the light from their thrusting tongues into a lofty room with drawn curtains and shelves of leather-bound books. Though the shutters were closed, the two men could hear, in the pauses of talk, a continuous distant roaring, which was the sound of surf breaking upon the bar outside the harbour of Montrose, 3 miles away. A small mahogany table with glasses and a decanter stood at Lord Balnillo's elbow, and he looked across at his brother James, whose life as a soldier had kept him much in foreign countries until the previous year, with an expression of mingled goodwill and patronage. David Logie was one of the many Scottish gentlemen of good birth who had made the law his profession, and he had just retired from the Edinburgh bench, on which, as Lord Balnillo, he had sat for hard upon quarter of a century. His face was fresh-coloured and healthy, and though he had not put on so much flesh as a man of sedentary ways who has reached the age of 62 might expect to carry, his main reason for retiring had been the long journeys on horseback over frightful roads, which a judge's duties forced him to take. Another reason was his estate of Balnillo, which was far enough from Edinburgh to make personal attention to it impossible. His wife Margaret, whose portrait hung in the dining room, had done all the business for many years, but Margaret was dead, and perhaps David, who had been a devoted husband, felt the need of something besides the law to fill up his life. He was a lonely man, for he had no children, and his brother James, who sat opposite to him, was his junior by 25 years. For one who had attained to his position, he was slow and curiously dependent on others. There was a turn about the lines of his countenance which suggested fretfulness, and his eyes, which had looked upon so many criminals, could be anxious. He was a considerate landlord, and, in spite of the times in which he lived, and the bottle at his elbow, a person of very sober habits. James Logie, who had started his career in Lord Orkney's regiment of foot with the Scots Brigade in Holland, had the same fresh complexion as his brother, and the same dark blue eyes, but they were eyes that had a different expression, and that seemed to see one thing at a time. He was a squarer, shorter man than Lord Balnillo, quicker of speech and movement. His mouth was a little crooked, for the centre of his lower lip did not come exactly under the centre of the upper one, and this slight mistake on the part of nature had given his face a not unpleasant look of virility. Most people who passed James gave him a second glance. Both men were carefully dressed and wore fine cambric cravats and laced coats, and the shoes of the judge, which rested on the fender, were adorned by gilt buckles. They had been silent for some time, as people are who have come to the same conclusion and find that there is no more to say, and in the quietness the heavy undercurrent of sound from the coast seemed to grow more insistent. "The bar is very loud tonight, Jamie," said Lord Balnillo. "I doubt but there's bad weather coming, and I'm loath to lose more trees." "I see that the old beech by the stables wants a limb," observed the other. "That's the only change about the place that I notice." "There'll be more yet," said the judge. "You've grown weather-wise since you left Edinburgh, David." "I had other matters to think upon there," answered Balnillo with some pomp. James smiled faintly, making the little twist in his lip more apparent. "Come out to the steps and look at the night," said he, snatching, like most restless men, at the chance of movement. They went out through the hall. James unbarred the front door, and the two stood at the top of the flight of stone steps. The entrance to Balnillo House faced northward, and a wet wind from the east, slight still but rising, struck upon their right cheeks and carried the heavy, muffled booming in through the trees. Balnillo looked frowning at their tops, which had begun to sway, but his brother's attention was fixed upon a man's figure, which was emerging from the darkness of the grass park in front of them. "Who is that?" cried the judge, as the footsteps grew audible. "It's a coach at the ford, my lord, a muckle coach that's coote in the water. Wullie and Tam and Andrew Robieson are seeking to cae it oot, but it's fast, my lord." "Is there anyone in it?" interrupted James. "Ay, there was, but he's oot noo." "Where is he?" "He'll nae get forward the night," continued the man, "and one o' the horse is lame. He cursin', my lord, and nae wonder. He can curse bonny. Robieson's got his wee laddie wi' him, and he garred the loony put his hands to his lugs. He's an elder, ye see." The judge turned to his brother. It was not the first time that the ford and the Den of Balnillo had been the scene of disaster, for there was an unlucky hole in it, and the state of the roads made storm-bound and bedraggled visitors common apparitions in the lives of country gentlemen. "If ye'll come with me, my lord, you'll hear him," said the labourer, to whom the profane victim of the ford was evidently an object of admiration. Balnillo looked down at his silk stockings and buckled shoes. "I should be telling the lasses to get a bed ready," he remarked hurriedly as he re-entered the house. James was already throwing his leg across the fence, though it was scarcely the cursing which attracted him, for he had heard oaths to suit every taste in his time. He hurried across the grass after the labourer. The night was not very dark, and they made straight for the ford. The Den of Balnillo ran from north to south not a quarter of a mile from the house, and the long chain of miry hollows and cart ruts, which did duty for a high road from Perth to Aberdeen, plunged through it at the point for which the men were heading. It was a steep ravine filled with trees and stones, through which the Balnillo burn flowed and fell and scrambled at different levels on its way to join the Basin of Montrose, as the great estuary of the River Esk was called. The ford lay just above one of the falls by which the water leapt downwards, and the dense darkness of the surrounding trees made it difficult for Captain Logie to see what was happening as he descended into the black well of the den. He could distinguish a confusion of objects by the light of the lantern, which his brother's men had brought and set upon a stone. The ford itself reflected nothing, for it was churned up into a sea of mud, in which, as Logie approached, the outline of a good-sized carriage, lying upon its side, became visible. "Yonder's the captain coming," said a voice. Someone lifted the lantern, and he found himself confronted by a tall young man, whose features he could not see, but who was, no doubt, the expert in language. "Sir," he said, I fear you have had a bad accident. I am come from Lord Balnillo to find out what he can do for you." "His lordship is mighty good," replied the young man, "and if he could force this mud hole, which, I am told, belongs to him, to yield up my conveyance, I should be his servant for life." There was a charm and softness in his voice which nullified the brisk impertinence of his words. "I hope you are not hurt," said James. "Not at all, sir. Providence has spared me. But he has had no mercy upon one of my poor nags, which has broken its knees, nor on my stock in trade, which is in the water. I am a travelling painter," he added quickly, "and had best introduce myself. My name is Archibald Flemington." The stranger had a difficulty in pronouncing his R's. He spoke them like a Frenchman, with a purring roll. The other was rather taken aback. Painters in those days had not the standing in society that they have now, but the voice and manner were unmistakably those of a man of breeding. Even his freedom was not the upstart license of one trying to assert himself, but the easy expression of a roving imagination. "I should introduce myself too," said Logie. "I am Captain James Logie, Lord Balnillo's brother. But we must rescue your baggage. Where is your postilion?" Flemington held up the lantern again, and its rays fell upon a man holding the two horses, which were standing together under a tree. James went towards them. "Poor beast," said he, as he saw the knees of one of the pair. "He would be better in a stall. Andrew Robison, send your boy to the house for a light, and then you can guide them to the stables." Meanwhile, the two other men had almost succeeded in getting the carriage once more upon its wheels, and with the help of Flemington and Logie it was soon righted. They decided to leave it where it was for the night, and it was dragged a little aside lest it should prove a pitfall to any chance traveller who might pass before morning. The two gentlemen went towards the house together, and the men followed, carrying Flemington's possessions and the great square package containing his canvases. When they entered the library, Lord Balnillo was standing with his back to the fire. "I have brought Mr. Flemington, brother," said Logie. "His coach has come to grief in the Den." Archie stopped short, and putting his heels together, made much the same bow as he had made to Mr. Duthie 18 years before. A feeling of admiration went through James as the warm light of the house revealed the person of his companion, and something in the shrewd wrinkles round his brother's unimpressive eyes irritated him. He felt a vivid interest in the stranger, and the cautious old man's demeanour seemed to have raised the atmosphere of a law court round himself. He was surveying the newcomer with stiff urbanity, but Archie made small account of it. "Sir," said Balnillo with condescension, "if you will oblige me by making yourself at home until you can continue your road, I shall take myself for fortunate." "My lord," replied Archie, "if you knew how like heaven this house appears to me after the bottomless pit in your den, you might take yourself for the Almighty." Balnillo gave his guest a critical look, and was met by all the soft darkness of a pair of liquid brown eyes which drooped at the outer corners, and were set under thick brows following their downward lines. Gentleness, inquiry, appeal were in them, and a quality which the judge, like other observers, could not define, a quality that sat far, far back from the surface. In spite of the eyes, there was no suggestion of weakness in the slight young man, and his long chin gave his olive face gravity. Speech and looks corresponded so little in him that Balnillo was bewildered, but he was a hospitable man, and he moved aside to make room for Archie on the hearth. The latter was a sorry sight as far as mud went, for his coat was splashed, and his legs from the knee down were of the colour of clay. He held his hands out to the blaze, stretching his fingers as a cat stretches her claws under a caressing touch. "Sit down and put your feet to the fire," said the judge, drawing forward one of the large armchairs. And James, do you call for another glass? When did you dine, Mr. Flemington?" "I did not dine at all, my lord. I was anxious to push on to Montrose, and I pushed on to destruction instead." He looked up with such a whimsical smile at his own mishaps that Balnillo found his mouth widening in sympathy. "I will go and tell them to make some food ready," said the captain, in answer to a sign from his brother. Balnillo stood contemplating the young man. The lines round his eyes were relaxing a little. He was fundamentally inquisitive, and his companion matched no type he had ever seen. He was a little disturbed by his assurance, yet his instinct of patronage was tickled by the situation. "I'm infinitely grateful to you," said Archie. "I know all the inns in Brechin, and very sensible how much better I am likely to dine here than there. You are too kind." "Then you know these parts?" "My home is at the other end of the county, at Ardguys." "I am familiar with the name," said Balnillo, "but until lately I have been so much in Edinburgh that I'm out of touch with other places. I am not even aware to whom it belongs." "It is a little property, my lord, nothing but a few fields and a battered old house, but it belongs to my grandmother Flemington, who brought me up. She lives very quietly." "Indeed, indeed," said the judge, his mind making a cast for a clue, as a hound does for the scent. He was not successful. "I had not taken you for a Scot," he said after a moment. "I've been told that," said Archie, "and that reminds me that it would be proper to tell your lordship what I am. I am a painter, and at this moment your hall is full of my paraphernalia." Lord Balnillo did not usually show his feelings, but the look which, in spite of himself, flitted across his face sent a gleam of entertainment through Archie. "You are surprised," he observed, sighing, "but when a man has to mend his fortunes, he must mend them with what tools he can. Nor am I ashamed of my trade." "There's no need, Mr. Flemington," replied the other, with a measured benevolence he had sometimes used upon the bench. "What you tell me does you honour, much honour, sir." "Then you did not take me for a painter any more than for a Scot?" asked Archie, smiling at his host. "I did not, sir," said the judge shortly. He was not accustomed to be questioned by his witnesses, and he had the uncomfortable sensation of being impelled, in spite of a certain prejudice, to think moderately well of his guest. "I have heard tell of your lordship very often," said the latter suddenly, "and I know very well into what good hands I have fallen. I could wish that all the world was more like yourself." He turned his head and stared wistfully at the coals. Balnillo could not make out whether this young fellow's assurance or his humility was the real keynote to the man, but he liked some of his sentiments well enough. Archie wore his own hair, and the old man noticed how silky and fine the brown waves were in the firelight. They were so near his hand as their owner leaned forward that he could almost have stroked them. "Are you going further than Montrose?" he inquired. "I had hoped to cozen a little employment out of Aberdeen," replied Flemington, "but it is a mere speculation. I have a gallery of the most attractive canvases with me women, divines, children, magistrates, provosts, all headless and all waiting to see what faces chance and I may fit on to their necks. I have one lady, an angel, I assure you, my lord, a vision of green silk and white roses, shoulders like satin, the hands of Venus." Balnillo was further bewildered. He knew little about the arts and nothing about artists. He had looked at many a contemporary portrait without suspecting that the original had chosen, as sitters often did, an agreeable ready-made figure from a selection brought forward by a painter, on which to display his or her countenance. It was a custom which saved the trouble of many sittings, and rectified much of the niggardliness or over-generosity of nature. "I puzzle you, I see," added Archie, laughing, "and no doubt the hair of Van Dyck would stand on end at some of our modern doings. but I'm not Van Dyke, unhappily, and in common with some others I do half my business before my sitters ever see me. A client has only to choose a suitable body for his own head, and I can tell you that many are thankful to have the opportunity." "I had no idea that portraits were done like that," said Lord Balnillo. "I never heard of such an arrangement before." "But you do not think it wrong, I hope," exclaimed Flemington, the gaiety dying out of his face. "There is no fraud about it. It is not as if a man deceived his sitter." The half petulant distress in his voice struck Balnillo and almost touched him. There was something so simple and confiding in it. "It might have entertained your lordship to see them," continued Archie ruefully. "I should have liked to show you the strange company I travel with." "So you shall, Mr. Flemington," said the old man. "It would entertain me very greatly. I only fear that the lady with the white roses may enslave me," he added, with rather obvious jocosity. "Indeed, now is the time for that," replied Archie, his face lighting up again, "for I hope she may soon wear the head of some fat town councillor's wife of Aberdeen." As he spoke, Captain Logie returned with the news that dinner was prepared. "I have been out to the stable to see what we could do for your horses," said he. "Thank you 1,000 times, sir," exclaimed Archie. Lord Balnillo watched his brother as he led the painter to the door. "I think I will come too, and sit with Mr. Flemington while he eats," he said, after a moment's hesitation. A couple of hours later Archie found himself in a comfortable bedroom. His valise had been soaked in the ford, and a nightshirt of Lord Balnillo's was warming at the fire. When he had put it on, he went and looked at himself in an old-fashioned mirror which hung on the wall. He was a good deal taller than the judge, but it was not his own image that caused the indescribable expression on his face. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Flemington. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nan Dodge. Flemington by Violet Jacob. Chapter 3. A Coach and 5. Archie sat in his bedroom at a table. The window was open, for it was a soft October afternoon, and he looked out meditatively at the prospect before him. The wind that had howled in the night had spent itself towards morning, and by midday the tormented sky had cleared and the curtain of cloud rolled away, leaving a mellow sun smiling over the basin of Montrose. He had never been within some miles of Balnillo, and the aspect of this piece of the country being new to him, his painter's eye rested appreciatively on what he saw. 2 avenues of ancient trees ran southward, one on either side of the house, and a succession of grass fields sloped away before him between these bands of timber to the tidal estuary, where the water lay blue and quiet, with the ribbon of the South Esk winding into it from the west. Beyond it, the low hills with their gentle rise touched the horizon. Nearer at hand, the beeches and gean trees, so dear to Lord Balnillo's heart, were red and gold. Here and there, where the gale had thinned the leaves, the bareness of stem and bough let in glimpses of the distant purple which was the veil of the farther atmosphere. To the east, shut out from his sight by all this wood, was the town of Montrose, set with its pointed steeple like the blue silhouette of some Dutch town between the Basin and the North Sea. A pen was in Flemington's hand, and the very long letter he had just written was before him. Balnillo House. Madam, my dear grandmother, I beg you to look upon the address at the head of this letter, and to judge whether fortune has favoured your devoted grandson. I am on the very spot, and what is more, seem likely to remain there indefinitely. Could anything in this untoward world have fallen out better? Montrose is a bare 3 miles from where I sit, and I can betake myself there on business when necessary, while I live as secluded as I please, cheek by jowl with the very persons whose acquaintance I had laid so many plots to compass. My dear grandmother, could you but have seen me last night when I lay down after my labours, tricked out in my worshipful host's nightshirt. Though the honest man is something of a fop in his attire, his arms are not so long as mine, and the fine ruffles on the sleeves did little more than adorn my elbows, which made me feel like a lady till I looked at my skirts. Then I felt more like a Highland man. But I'm telling you, only effects when you are wanting causes. I changed horses at Brechin, having got so far in safety just after dark, and went on towards Montrose with the wind rising and never a star to look comfort at me through the coach window. Though I knew we must be on the right road, I asked my way at every hovel we passed, and was much interested when I was told that I was at the edge of my Lord Balnillo's estate, and not far from his house. The road soon afterwards took a plunge into the very vilest place I ever saw, a steep way scarcely fit for a cattle road between a mass of trees. I put out my head and heard the rushing of water. Oh, what a fine thing memory is! I remembered having heard of the den of Balnillo and being told that it was near Balnillo House, and I judged we must be there. Another minute, and we were clattering among stones. The water was up to the axle, and we rocked like a ship. One wheel was higher than the other, and we leaned over so that I could scarcely sit. Then I was inspired. I threw myself with all my weight against the side, and dragged so much of my cargo of canvases as I could lay hold of with me. There was a great splash, and over we went. It was mighty hard work getting out, for the devil caused the door to stick fast, and I had to crawl through the window at that side of the coach which was turned to the sky like a roof. I hope I may never be colder. We turned to and got the horses out and on to dry ground, and the postillion, a very frog for slime and mud, began to shout, which soon produced a couple of men with a lantern. I shouted too, and did my poor best in the way of oaths to give the affair all the colour of reality I could, and I believe I was successful. The noise brought more people about us, and with them my lord's brother, Captain Logie, hurrying to the rescue with a fellow who had run to the house with news of our trouble. The result was that we ended our night, the coach with a cracked axle and a hole in the panel, the postillion in the servants' hall with half a bottle of good Scots whisky inside him, the horses, one with a broken knee, in the stable, and myself, as I tell you, in his lordship's nightshirt. I promise you that I thought myself happy when I got inside the mansion, a solemn block with a grand manner of its own, and Corinthian pillars in the dining room. His lordship was on the hearthrug, as solemn as his house, but with a pinched, precise look which it has not got. He was no easy nut to crack, and it took me a little time to establish myself with him. But the good James, his brother, left us a little while alone, and I made all the way I could in his favour. I may have trouble with the old man, and at any rate must be always at my best with him, for he seems to me to be silly, virtuous, and cunning all at once. He is vain, too, and suspicious, and has seen so many wicked people in his judicial career that I must not let him confound me with them. I could see that he had difficulty in making my occupation and appearance match to his satisfaction. He wears a mouse-coloured velvet coat, and is very nice in the details of his dress. I should like you to see him, not because he would amuse you, but because it would entertain me so completely to see you together. James, his brother, is cut to a very different pattern. He is many years younger than his lordship, not a dozen years older than myself, I imagine, and he has spent much of his life with Lord Orkney's regiment in Holland. There is something mighty attractive in his face, though I cannot make out what it is. It is strange that, although he seems to be a much simpler person than the old man, I feel less able to describe him. I have had much talk with him this morning, and I don't know when I have liked anyone better. And now comes the triumph of well-doing, the climax to which all this faithful record leads. I am to paint his lordship's portrait in his judge's robes, and am installed here definitely for that purpose. I shall be grateful if you will send me my chestnut brown suit and a couple of fine shirts, also the silk stockings which are in the top shelf of my cupboard, and all you can lay hands on in the matter of cravats. My valise was soaked through and through, and though the clothes I am wearing were dried in the night, I am rather short of good coats, for I expected to end in an inn at Montrose rather than in a gentleman's house. Though I am within reach of Ardguys and might ride to fetch them in person, I do not want to be absent unnecessarily. Any important letters that I may send you will go by a hand I know of. I shall go shortly to Montrose by way of procuring myself some small necessity, and shall search for that hand. Its owner should not be difficult to recognize by all accounts. And now, my dear grandmother, I shall write myself, your dutiful and devoted grandson, Archibald Flemington. Archie sealed his letter and then rose and leaned far out of the window. The sun still bathed the land, but it was getting low. The tree-tops were thrusting their heads into a light which had already left the grass parks slanting away from the house. The latter part of his morning had been taken up by his host's slow inspection of his canvases, and he longed for a sight of his surroundings. He knew that the brothers had gone out together, and he took his hat and stood, irresolute, with his letter in his hand, before a humble-looking little locked case, which he had himself rescued the night before from among his submerged belongings in the coach, hesitating whether he should commit the paper to it or keep it upon his own person. It seemed to be a matter for some consideration. Finally, he put it into his pocket and went out. He set forth down one of the avenues, walking on a gorgeous carpet of fallen leaves, and came out on a road running east and west, evidently another connecting Brechin with Montrose. He smiled as he considered it, realizing that, had he taken it last night, he would have escaped the den of Balnillo and many more desirable things at the same time. As he stood looking up and down, he heard a liquid rush and saw to his right a mill dam glimmering through the trees, evidently the goal of the waters which had soused him so lately. He strolled towards it, attracted by the forest of stems and golden foliage reflected in the pool, and by the slide down which the stream poured into a field, to wind like a little serpent through the grass. Just where it disappeared stood a stone mill house abutting on the highway, from which came the clacking of a wheel. The miller was at his door. Archie could see that he was watching something with interest, for the man stood out, a distinct white figure, on the steps running up from the road to the gaping doorway in the mill wall. Flemington was one of those blessed people for whom common sights do not glide by, a mere meaningless procession of alien things. Humanity's smallest actions had an interest for him, for he had that love of seeing effect follow cause, which is at once priceless and childish. Priceless because anything that lifts from us the irritating burden of ourselves for so much as a moment is priceless, and childish because it is a survival of the years when all the universe was new. Priceless yet again because it will often lead us down unexpected side tracks of knowledge in a world in which knowledge is power. He sat down on the low wall bounding the mill field, for he was determined to know what the miller was staring at. Whatever it was on the farther side of a cottage built just across the road from the mill. He was suddenly conscious that a barefooted little girl with tow-coloured hair had appeared from nowhere and was standing beside him. She also was staring at the house by the mill, but with occasional furtive glances at himself. All at once the heavy drone of a bagpipe came towards them. Then the shrill notes of the chanter began to meander up and down on the blare of sonorous sound like a light pattern running over a dark background. The little girl removed her eyes from the stranger and cut a caper with her bare feet as though she would like to dance. It was evident that the sounds had affected Flemington too, but not in the same way. He made a sharp exclamation under his breath and turned to the child. "Who is that playing?" he cried, putting out his hand. She jumped back and stood staring. "Who is that playing?" he repeated. She was still dumb, scrubbing one foot against her bare ankle after the manner of the shoeless when embarrassed. Archie was exasperated. He rose without further noticing the child and hurried towards the mill. When he had reached the place where the stream dived through a stone arch under the road, he found she was following him. He heard the pad pad of her naked soles in the mud. All at once she was moved to answer his question. "Yon's Skirlin' Wattie!" she yelled after him. But he strode on, taking no notice. Fortune was playing into his hand so wonderfully that he was ceasing to be surprised. In the little yard of the cottage he found a small crowd of children, 2 women, and the miller's man collected round the strangest assortment of living creatures he had ever seen. The name Skirlin' Wattie had conveyed something to him, and he was prepared for the extraordinary, but his breath was almost taken away by the oddness of what he saw. In the middle of the group was a stout wooden box, which, mounted on very low wheels, was transformed into the likeness of a rough go-cart, and to this were yoked 5 dogs of differing breeds and sizes. A half-bred mastiff in the wheel of the team was taking advantage of the halt, and lay dozing, his jowl on his paws, undisturbed by the blast of sound which poured over his head, whilst his companion, a large, smooth-haired yellow cur, stood alert with an almost proprietary interest in what was going on, awake in his amber eyes. The couple of collies in front of them sniffed furtively at the bystanders, and the wire-haired terrier, which, as leader, was harnessed singly in advance of the lot, was sharing a bannock with a newly breeched man-child, the sinister nature of whose squint almost made the dog's confidence seem misplaced. The occupant of the cart was an elderly man whom accident had deprived of the lower part of his legs, both of which had been amputated just below the knee. He had the head of Falstaff, the shoulders of Hercules, and lack of exercise had made his thighs and back bulge out over the sides of his carriage, even as the bag of his pipes bulged under his elbow. He was dressed in tartan breeches and doublet, and he wore a huge Kilmarnock bonnet with a red knob on the top. The lower half of his face was distended by his occupation, and at the appearance of Flemington by the gate, he turned on him, above the billows of crimson cheek and grizzled whisker, the boldest pair of eyes that the young man had ever met. He was a masterly piper, and as the tune stopped, a murmur of applause went through the audience. "Man, you're the most mountaneous player in Scotland," said the miller's man, who was a coiner of words. "Ay, dod, am I," replied the piper. "Ay," continued the miller's man, holding out an apple. The beggar took it with that silent wag of the back of his head which seems peculiar to the east coast of Scotland, and dropped it into the cart. Archie handed him a sixpence. "Ye'll hae to give us mair noo," cried the squinting child, whose eyes had seen straight enough, who seemed to have a keen sense of values. "Ay, a sang this time," added its mother. "Ye'll get a pucklie meal and a bawbee gin ye sing the tod," chimed in an old woman, who had suddenly put her head out of the upper story of the cottage. The beggar laid down his pipes and spat on earth. Then he opened his mouth and gave forth a voice whose volume, flexibility, and extreme sweetness seemed incredible considering the being from whom it emanated. There's a tod aye blinkin' when the nicht comes doon, blinkin' with his langin' and keekin' round and round, creepin' by the farmyard when gloamin' is to fa', and syne there'll be a chicken or a dook awa'. Aye, when the guidwife rises, there's a dook awa'. There's a lass sits greetin' ben the hoose at hame, for when the guidwife's cankered, she's gies her aye the blame, and sair the lassie sobbin', and fast the tears fa', for the guidwife's taint a bonny hen, and it's awa'. Aye, she's no sae easy dealt wi' when her gear's awa'. There's a lad aye roamin' when the day gets late, a lang-legged devil with his hand upon the gate, and aye the guidwife cries to him to gar the toddy fa', for she canna thole to let her chicks and dooks awa'. Aye, the muckle bubbly Jock himself is cad awa'. The laddie saw the tod gae by and killed him wi' a stane, and the bonny lass wha grat sae sair she sits nae mair her lane. But the guidwife's no contented yet, her like ye never saw. Cries she, this time it is the lass, and she's awa'. Aye, yon laddie's waur nor any tod, for Jean's awa'. Archie beat the top rail of the paling with so much enthusiasm that the yellow cur began to bark. The beggar quieted him with a storm of abuse. The beldame disappeared from the window, and her steps could be heard descending the wooden stair of the cottage. She approached the cart with a handful of meal on a platter, which skirling Wattie tilted into an old leather bag that hung on his carriage. "Whaur's the bawbee?" cried the squinting child. A shout of laughter went up, led by Archie. "He kens there's nae muckle weicht o' meal, and what should ken it better?" said the beggar, balancing the bag on his palm and winking at the miller's man. The latter, who happened to be the child's unacknowledged parent, disappeared behind the house. "One more song, and I will supply the bawbee," said Archie, throwing another coin into the cart. Skirling Wattie sent a considering glance at his patron. Though he might not understand refinement, he could recognize it, and much of his local success had come from his nice appraisement of audiences. "I'll gie ye Logie Kirk," said he. "O Logie Kirk among the braes, I'm thinking o' the merry days, afore I trod the weary ways that led me far frae Logie. Fine do I mind when I was young, aboon thy graves the mavis sung, and ilka birdie had a tongue to ca' me back to Logie. O Logie Kirk, though aye the same the burn sings aye remembered name, there's ne'er a voice to cry 'Come hame' to bonnie Bess at Logie. Far, far awa' the years decline, there took the lassie what was mine, and laid her sleepin' lang, lang syne among the braes at Logie." His voice and the wonderful pathos of his phrasing fascinated Archie, but as the last cadences fell from his mouth, the beggar snatched up the long switch with which he drove his team and began to roar. "I'm awa'!" he shouted, making every wall and corner echo. "Open the gate and let me through, ye misbegotten bairns o' Old Nick! Stand back, ye clorty faced weans, and let me out! Round about and up the road, just round about and up the road, I tell ye!" The last sentences were addressed to the dogs, who were now all on their legs and mindful of the stick whirling in the air above them. Archie could see that he was not included in the beggar's general address, but, being nearest to the gate, he swung it open, and the whole equipage dashed through, the dogs guided with amazing dexterity between the posts by their master's switch. The rapid circle they described on the road as they were turning up the hill towards Brechin seemed likely to upset the cart, but the beggar leaned outward so adroitly that none of the four wheels left the ground. As they went up the incline, he took up his pipes, and leaving the team to its own guidance, tuned up and disappeared round the next bend in a blast of sound. Flemington would have given a great deal to run after him and could easily have overtaken the cart, for its pace was not very formidable. But the whole community, including the tow-headed little girl, was watching Skirling Wattie out of sight and speculating, he knew, upon his own identity. So he walked leisurely on till the road turned at the top of the hill, and he was rewarded at the other side of its bend by the sight of the beggar halting his team by a pond at which the dogs were drinking. He threw a look round and behind him. Then, as no human creature was to be seen, he gave a loud whistle, holding up his arm, and began to run. Skirling Wattie awaited him at the pond side, and as Archie approached, he could almost feel his bold eyes searching him from top to toe. He stopped by the cart. "My name is Flemington," said he. "I've heard worse," replied the other calmly. "And I have a description of you in my pocket," continued Archie. "Perhaps you would like to see it." The beggar looked up at him from under his bushy eyebrows with a smile of the most robust and genial effrontery that he had ever seen on a human face. "I'd need to," said he. Archie took a folded paper from his pocket. "You see that signature?" he said, putting his forefinger on it. The other reached up to take the paper. "No, no," said Flemington, "this never goes out of my hand." "That's you!" exclaimed the beggar with some admiration. "Put it back. I ken it." He unhooked his leather bag, which hung inside the cart on its front board. This Archie perceived to be made, apparently for additional strength, of two thicknesses of wood. Skirling Wattie slid the inner plank upwards, and the young man saw a couple of sealed letters hidden behind it, one of which was addressed to himself. "Tak yon," said the beggar, as the sound of a horse's tread was heard not far off. "Tak it quick and syne awa ye gang. Mind ye, a gang ilka twa days from Montrose to Brechin, and I'm aye skirlin' as a gang." "And do you take this one and have it sent on from Brechin," said Archie hurriedly, handing him the letter he had written to Madam Flemington. The other wagged the back of his head and laid a finger against the rim of his bonnet. Archie struck into the fields by the pond, and had time to drop down behind a whin bush before an inoffensive-looking farmer went by on his way between the two towns. The beggar continued his progress, singing to himself, and Flemington, who did not care to face the mill and the curious eyes of the tow-headed little girl again, took a line across country back to Balnillo. He hated the tow-headed little girl. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Flemington. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nan Dodge. Flemington by Violet Jacob. Chapter 4. Business. Events seemed to Flemington to be moving fast. Lord Balnillo dined soon after 5, and during the meal the young man tried to detach his mind from the contents of the letter lying in his pocket, and to listen to his host's talk, which ran on the portrait to be begun next morning. The judge had ordered his robes to be taken out and aired carefully, and a little room with a north aspect had been prepared for the first sitting. The details of Archie's trade had excited the household below stairs, and the servant who waited appeared to look upon him with the curious mixture of awe and contempt accorded to charlatans and to those connected with the arts. Only James seemed to remain outside the circle of interest, like a wayfarer who pauses to watch the progress of some wayside bargain with which he has no concern. Yet, though Archie's occupations did not move Logie, the young man felt intuitively that he was anything but a hostile presence. "With your permission, I shall go early to bed tonight," said Flemington to his host, as the three sat over their wine by the dining-room fire, and the clock's hands pointed to 8. "Fie!" said the judge. You are a young man to be thinking of such things at this hour." "My bones have not forgotten yesterday," began Archie. "And what would you do if you had to ride the circuit, sir?" exclaimed Balnillo, looking sideways at him like a sly old crow. "Man, James, you and I have had other things to consider besides our bones, and here's Mr. Flemington, who might be your son and my grandson, havering about his bed." Archie laughed aloud. "Captain Logie would need to have married young for that," he cried, "and I cannot picture your lordship as anybody's grandfather." "Come, Jamie, how old are you?" inquired his brother, in a tone that had a light touch of gratification. "I lose count nowadays," said James, sighing. "I must be near upon 38, I suppose. Life's a long business, after all." "Yours has scarcely been long enough to have begotten me, unless you had done so at 12 years old," observed Archie. "When I had to ride the circuit," began Balnillo, setting down his glass and joining his hands across his waistcoat, "I had many a time to stick fast in worse places than the Den yonder. Ay, and to leave my horse where he was and get forward on my clerk's nag. I've been forced to sit on the bench in another man's wig because my own had rolled in the water in my luggage and was a plaster of dirt, maybe never fit to be seen again upon a Lord of Session's head." Logie smiled with his crooked mouth. He remembered, though he did not mention the vernacular rhyme written on that occasion by some impudent member of the junior bar: "Auld David Balnillo gangs wantin' his wig, and he's seeking the loan of anither as big. A modest request, and there's naething agin it, but he'd better hae such a new head to put in it." "It was only last year," continued his brother, "that I gave up the saddle and the bench together." "That was more from choice than from necessity. At least, so I have heard," said Archie. "You heard that, Mr. Flemington?" "My lord, do you think that we obscure country folk know nothing, or that reputations don't fly farther than Edinburgh? The truth is that we of the younger generation are not made of the same stuff. That is what my grandmother tells me so often that from force of habit I don't listen, but I have begun to believe it at last." "She is a wise woman," said Balnillo. "She has been a mighty attractive one," observed Archie meditatively. "At least, so she was thought at St. Germain." "At St. Germain!" exclaimed the judge. "My grandfather died in exile with his master, and my father too," replied Flemington quietly. There was a silence, and then James Logie opened his mouth to speak, but Archie had risen. "Let me go, Lord Balnillo," he said. "The truth is, my work needs a steady hand, and I mean to have it when I begin your portrait tomorrow." When he had gone, James took the empty seat by his brother. "His grandfather with the king, and he followed this womanish trade!" he exclaimed. "I should like to have asked him more about his father," said Balnillo, "but—" "He did not wish to speak, I could see that," said James. "I like the fellow, David, in spite of his paint pots. I would like him much if I had time to like anything." "I have been asking myself, am I a fool to be keeping him here?" said the other. "Was I right to let a strange man into the house at such a time? I am relieved, James. He is on the right side." "He keeps his ears open, brother." "He seems to know all about me," observed Balnillo. "He's a fine lad, Jamie, a lad of fine taste, and his free tongue hasn't interfered with his good sense, and I am relieved, as I said." Logie smiled again. The affection he had for his brother was of that solid quality which accepts a character in the lump and loves it for its best parts. David's little vanities and vacillations, his meticulous love of small things, were plain enough to the soldier, and he knew well that the bench and the bar alike had found plenty to make merry over in Balnillo. He had all the loyal feelings which the Scot of his time bore to the head of his family, and, as his sentiments towards him sprang from the heart rather than from the brain, it is possible that he undervalued the sudden fits of shrewdness which would attack his brother as headache or ague might tack another man. The fact that David's colleagues had never made this mistake was responsible for a career the success of which surprised many who knew the judge by hearsay alone. Drink, detail, and indecision have probably ruined more characters than any 3 other influences in the world, but the 2 latter had not quite succeeded with Lord Balnillo, and the former had passed him over. "I wonder," said James. "I wonder, is it a good chance that has sent him here? Could we make anything of him, David?" "Whisht, James," said the other, turning his face away quickly. "You go too fast. And mind you, if a man has only one notion in his head, there are times when his skull is scarce thick enough to stand between his thoughts and the world." "That is true, but I doubt Flemington's mind is too much taken up with his pictures to think what is in other men's heads." "Maybe," replied Balnillo, "but we'll know that better a few days hence. I am not sorry he has gone to bed." "I will give him an hour to get between his blankets," said Logie, drawing out his watch. "That should make him safe." Meanwhile, Flemington had reached his room and was pulling a great package of spare canvases from under his sombre 4-poster. He undid the straps which secured them, and drew from between 2 of them a long dark riding coat, thrusting back the bundle into its place. He changed his clothes and threw those he had taken off on a chair. Then he took the little locked box he had saved so carefully from the catastrophe of the previous night, and standing on the bed, he laid it on the top of the tester, which was near enough to the ceiling to prevent any object placed upon it from being seen. He gathered a couple of cushions from a couch, and beating them up, arranged them between the bedclothes, patting them into a human-looking shape. Though he meant to lock his door and to keep the key in his pocket during the absence he contemplated, and though he had desired the servants not to disturb him until an hour before breakfast, he had the good habit of preparing for the worst. He slipped out, with the coat over his arm, turned the key, and walked softly but boldly down into the hall. He paused outside the dining room, listening to the hum of the brothers' voices, then disappeared down the back stairs. If he found the door into the stable yard secured, he meant to call someone from the kitchen regions to open it and to announce that he was going out to look at his disabled horse. He would say that he intended to return through the front door by which Captain Logie had promised to admit him. Everything was quiet. The only sign of life was the shrill voice of a maid singing in the scullery as she washed the dishes, and the house was not shut up for the night. Through the yard he went, and out unmolested under the great arch which supported the stable clock, and then ran swiftly round to the front. He passed under the still lighted windows and plunged into a mass of trees and undergrowth which headed the eastern approach. Once among the friendly shadows, he put on the coat, buttoning it closely about his neck, and took a small grey wig from one of its deep pockets. When he had adjusted this under his hat, he emerged, crossed the avenue, dropped over the sunk wall dividing it from the fields, and made down them till he reached the Montrose road. Through the still darkness, the sound of the Balnillo stable clock floated after him, striking 9. There was not enough light to show him anything but his nearest surroundings. The wall which bounded the great Balnillo grass parks was at his left hand, and by it he guided his steps, keeping a perpetual look out to avoid stumbling over the inequalities and loose stones, for there were no side paths to the roads in those days. He knew that the town was only 3 miles off, and that the dark stretch which extended on his right was the basin of Montrose. A cold snap played in the air, reminding him that autumn, which in Scotland keeps its mellowness late, was some way forward, and this sting in the breath of night was indicated by a trembling of the stars in the dark vault overhead. He hastened on, for time was precious. The paper which he had taken from Skirling Wattie's hands had bid him prepare to follow Logie into the town when dark set in, but it had been able to tell him neither at what hour the soldier would start nor whether he would walk or ride. His chance in meeting the beggar so soon had put him in possession of James's usual movements immediately, but it had given him little time to think out many details, and the gaps in his plans had been filled in by guesswork. He did not think James would ride, for there had been no sound of preparation in the stable. His intention was to reach the town first, to conceal himself by its entrance, and when James should pass, to follow him to his destination. He had a rough map of Montrose in his possession, and with its help he had been able to locate the house for which he suspected him to be bound, a house known by the party he served to be one of the meeting places of the adherents of Charles Edward Stuart. Archie's buoyancy of spirit was sufficient to keep at arm's length a regret he could not quite banish, for he had the happy carelessness that carries a man easily on any errand which has possibilities of development, more from the cheerful love of chance than from responsible feeling. His light-hearted courage and tenacity were buried so deep under a luxuriance of effrontery, grace, and mother wit, and the glamour of a manner difficult to resist, that hardly anyone but Madam Flemington, who had brought him up, suspected the toughness of their quality. He had the refinement of a woman, yet he had extorted the wonder of an East Coast Scotsman by his comprehensive profanity, the expression at times of a timid girl, yet he would plunge into a flood of difficulties whose further shore he did not trouble to contemplate. But these contrasts in him spoke of no repression, no conscious effort. He merely rode every quality in his character with a loose rein, and while he attempted to puzzle nobody, he had the acuteness to know that his audience would puzzle itself by its own conception of him. The regret which he ignored was the regret that he was obliged to shadow a man who pleased him as much as did James Logie. He realized how much more satisfaction he would have got out of his present business had its object been Lord Balnillo. He liked James's voice, his bearing, his crooked mouth, and something intangible about him which he neither understood nor tried to understand. The iron hand of Madam Flemington had brought him up so consistently to his occupation that he accepted it as a part of life. His painting he used as a means, not as an end, and the changes and chances of his main employment were congenial to a temperament at once boyish and capable. The Pleiades rode high above Taurus, and Orion's hands were coming up over the eastern horizon as he reached the narrow street which was the beginning of Montrose. The place was dark and ill lit, like every country town of those days, and here, by the North Port, as it was called, the irregularities of the low houses, with their outside stairs, offered a choice of odd corners in which he might wait unseen. He chose the narrowest part of the street, that he might see across it the more readily, and drew back into the cavity roofed in by the stair-head of a projecting flight of steps which ran sideways up a wall. Few people would leave the town at that hour, and those who were still abroad were likely to keep within its limits. A wretched lamp stuck in a niche of an opposite building made his position all the more desirable, for the flicker which it cast would be sufficient to throw up the figure of Logie should he pass beneath it. He watched a stealthy cat cross its shine with an air of suppressed melodrama that would have befitted a man-eating tiger, and the genial bellowing of a couple of drunken men came down the high street as he settled his shoulders against the masonry at his back and resigned himself to a probable hour of tedium. Not a mile distant, James Logie was coming along the Montrose road. He had trodden it many times in the darkness during the past weeks, and his mind was roving far from his steps, far even from the errand on which he was bent. He was thinking of Archie, whom he believed to be snug in bed at Balnillo. He had gone out last night and landed this fantastic piece of young humanity from the Den, as a man may land a salmon, and he had contemplated him ever since with a kind of fascination. Flemington was so much unlike any young man he had known that the difference half shocked him, and though he had told his brother that he liked the fellow, he had done so in spite of one side of himself. It was hard to believe that but a dozen years divided them, for he had imagined Archie much younger, and the appeal of his boyishness was a strong one to Logie, who had had so little time for boyishness himself. His life since he was 15 had been merged in his profession, and the restoration of the Stuarts had been for many years the thing nearest to his heart. There had been one exception to this, and that had long gone out of his life, taking his youth with it. He was scarcely a sad man, but he had the habit of sadness, which is as hard a one to combat as any other, and the burst of youth and buoyancy that had come in suddenly with Archie had blown on James like a spring wind. Archie's father and grandfather had died in exile too, with Charles Edward's parents, and his eyes reminded him of other eyes. The events that had taken place since the landing of the Prince in July had made themselves felt all up the east coast, and the country was Jacobite almost to a man. Charles Edward had raised his standard at Glenfinnan, had marched on Edinburgh in the early part of September, and had established himself in Holyrood on the surrender of the town. After his victory over Cope at Preston Pans, he had collected his forces on Portobello Sands, 13 regiments composed of the Highland clans, 5 regiments of Lowlanders, 2 troops of horse commanded by Lords Elcho and Balmerino, and 2 others under Lord Kilmarnock and Lord Pitsligo. The command of the latter consisted of Angus men armed with such weapons as they owned or could gather. The insurgent army had entered England in 2 portions, one of these led by Lord George Murray, and one by the Prince himself, who marched at the head of his men, sharing the fatigues of the road with them, and fascinating the imagination of the Scots by his hopeful good humour and his keen desire to identify himself with his soldiers. The 2 bodies had concentrated on Carlisle, investing the city, and after a few days of defiance the mayor displayed the white flag on the ramparts and surrendered the town keys. After this, the Prince and his father had been proclaimed at the market cross in presence of the municipality. But in spite of this success, the signs of the times were not consistently cheering to the Jacobite party. There had been many desertions during the march across the border, and no sooner had the Prince's troops left Edinburgh than the city had gone back to the Whig dominion. At Perth and Dundee the wind seemed to be changing too, and only the country places stuck steadily to the Prince and went on recruiting for the Stuarts. Although he was aching to go south with the invaders, now that the English were advancing in force, Logie was kept in the neighbourhood of Montrose by the business he had undertaken. His own instincts and inclinations were ever those of a fighter, and he groaned in spirit over the fate which had made it his duty to remain in Angus, concerned with recruiting and the raising of money and arms. He had not yet openly joined the Stuarts in spite of his ardent devotion to their cause, because it had been represented to him that he was, for the moment, a more valuable asset to his party whilst he worked secretly than he could be in the field. The question that perplexed the coast of Angus was the landing of those French supplies so sorely needed by the half-fed, half-clothed, half-paid troops in the face of the English cruisers that haunted the coast, and it was these matters that kept Logie busy. James knew the harbour of Montrose as men know the places which are the scenes of the forbidden exploits of their youth. This younger son, who was so far removed in years from the rest of his family as to be almost like an only child, was running wild in the town among the fisher folk, and taking surreptitious trips across the bar, when the staid David was pursuing his respectable career at a very different kind of bar in Edinburgh. He was the man that Montrose needed in this emergency, and tonight he was on his way to the town, for he would come there a couple of times in the week as secretly as he could to meet one David Ferrier, a country gentleman who had joined the regiment of 600 men raised by Lord Ogilvy, and had been made Deputy Governor of Brechin for the Prince. Ferrier was also a man well calculated to serve the cause. He owned a small property and a farm not far from the village of Edzell, situated at the foot of a glen running up into the Grampians, and his perfect knowledge of the country and its inhabitants of all degrees gave him an insight into every turn of feeling that swept through it in those troubled days. The business of his farm had brought him continually into both Brechin and Montrose, and the shepherds, travelling incessantly with their flocks from hill to strath, formed one of his many chains of intelligence. He had joined Lord Ogilvy a couple of months earlier, and though he was now stationed at Brechin with 100 men of his corps, he would absent himself for a night at a time, staying quietly at Montrose in the house of a former dependent of his own, that he might keep an eye upon the movements of an English ship. The government sloop of war Venture had come into the harbour, carrying 16 guns and about 80 men, and had anchored south of the town, in the strait made by the passage of the River Esk into the sea. Montrose apparently was to suffer for the work she had done as a port for Stuart supplies, for the Venture, lying at a convenient distance just under the fishing village of Ferryden, had fired heavily on the town, though no Jacobite troops were there. The commander had unrigged the shipping and burned 2 trading barques whose owners were townsmen, and he had landed a force at the fort which had captured the town guns and had carried them on board a vessel lying at the quay. Ferrier looked with complete trust to James Logie and his brother, Balnillo. The old man, during his judicial career, had made some parade of keeping himself aloof from politics, and as his retirement had taken place previous to the landing of the Prince, he had sunk the public servant in the country gentleman before the world of politicians began to divide the sheep from the goats. For some time few troubled their heads about the peaceable and cautious old Lord of Session, whose inconspicuous talents were vegetating among the trees and grass parks that the late Lady Balnillo had husbanded so carefully for him. As to his very much younger brother, who had been incessantly absent from his native land, his existence was practically forgotten. But because the Government Secret Intelligence Department on the East Coast had remembered it at last with some suspicion, Flemington had been sent to Montrose with directions to send his reports to its agent in Perth, and Flemington had bettered his orders in landing himself at Balnillo. As Archie heard a steady tread approaching, he shrank farther back under the stair. He could only distinguish a middle-sized male figure which might belong to anyone, and he followed it with straining eyes to within a few feet of the lamp. Here it paused, and, skirting the light patch, stepped out into the middle of the way. He scarcely breathed. He was not sure yet, though the man had come nearer by half the street, but the height matched his expectation, and the avoidance of the solitary light proved the desire for secrecy in the person before him. As the man moved on, he slipped from his shelter and followed him, keeping just enough distance between them to allow him to see the way he went. The 2 figures passed up the High Street, one behind the other, Flemington shrinking close to the walls and drawing a little nearer. Before they had gone 100 yards, his unconscious guide turned suddenly into one of those narrow, covered-in alleys, or closes as they are called, which started at right angles from the main street. Archie dived in after him as unconcernedly as he would have dived into the mouth of hell, had his interest taken him that way. These closes, characteristic of Scottish towns to this day, were so long, and burrowed under so many sightless-looking windows and doors, to emerge in unexpected places, that he admired James's knowledge of the short cuts of Montrose, though it seemed to him no more than natural. The place for which he conceived him to be making was a house in the New Wynd named the Happy Land, and kept by a well-known widow for purposes which made its insignificance an advantage. It was used, as he had heard, by the Jacobite community, because the frequent visitors who entered after dusk passed in without more comment from the townspeople than could be expressed in a lifted eyebrow or a sly nudge. It was a disconcerting moment even to him when the man in front of him stopped, and what he had taken for the distant glimmer of an open space revealed itself as a patch of whitewash with a door in it. The close was a cul-de-sac. Flemington stood motionless as the other knocked at the door. Flight was undesirable, for James might give chase, and capture would mean the end of a piece of work of which he was justly proud. He guessed himself to be the fleeter-footed of the two, but he knew nothing of the town's byways, and other night birds besides Logie might join in. But his bold wit did not desert him, for he gave a loud drunken shout, as like those he had heard at the North Port as he could make it, and lurched across the close. Its other inmate turned towards him, and as he did so, Archie shouted again, and stumbling against him, subsided upon the paved floor. The door beyond them opened a little, showing a portion of a scared face and a hand which held a light. "Good sakes! What'll be wrang?" inquired a tremulous female voice. The man was standing over Archie, pushing him with his foot. His answer may have reassured the questioner, but it had a different effect upon the heap on the ground. "Hoot, woman, don't be a fool! It's me, Ferrier." End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Flemington. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nan Dodge. Flemington by Violet Jacob, Chapter 5, The Happy Land. The door opened a little further. "Here," said Ferrier to the woman, "go up and bring me the roll of unwritten paper from the table." "You'll no be coming in?" "Not now. Maybe in another hour or more." "But what's yon?" said she. "Lord, woman, have you lived all these years in Montrose and never seen a drunken man?" exclaimed he impatiently. "Shut the door, I'm telling you, and get what I want. He will not trouble you. He's past troubling anybody." She obeyed, and Archie heard a bolt shot on the inside. Though he had been startled on discovering his mistake, he now felt comforted by it, for, being unknown to Ferrier, he was much safer with him than he would have been with James. He raised his head and tried to get an idea of his companion's face, but the darkness of the close was too great to let him distinguish his features. He had discovered where he lived by accident, but though a description of the man was in the little box now reposing on the tester of his bed at Balnillo, he did not know him by sight. These things were going through his mind as the woman returned from her lodger's errand, and the door had just been made fast again, when there was a step at the close's mouth, and another man came quickly in, stopping short as he found it occupied. Ferrier coughed. "Ferrier," said James's voice softly, "what is this?" he asked, as his foot came in contact with Archie. "It's a drunken brute who came roaring in here a minute syne and fell head over heels at my door," replied the other. "The town is full of them tonight." He stooped down and took Flemington by the shoulder. "Up you get!" he cried, shaking him. Archie breathed heavily and let his whole weight hang on Ferrier's hand. "Haud awa' frae me, lassie," he expostulated thickly. Logie laughed. "He must be far gone indeed to take you for a lass," he observed. Ferrier gave Archie a stronger shake. "I'll no gang hame wantin' Annie," continued Flemington, whose humour was beginning to find some pleasure in the situation. The raw vernacular that he had mastered with absolute success in childhood was at his tongue's end still. "Come, come," said James. Ferrier moved forward, but Archie had reached out a limp hand and taken him by the ankle. "Annie," he muttered, "ma bonnie, bonnie Annie." Ferrier, who had nearly fallen forward, tried to strike out with his foot, but Archie's grip, nerveless yet clinging as a limpet, held him fast. "A tell ye, I'll nae gang hame wantin' Annie," he repeated more loudly. "He has me by the foot, damn him!" said Ferrier. James swore quietly but distinctly. "Annie! Annie!" roared Archie, making the silent close echo again. "Great heavens!" exclaimed the exasperated James. "We shall have the whole town out of bed if this goes on. Shake him off, man, and let us be going." He bent down as he spoke, and groping in the darkness found Flemington's heels. He seized them and began to drag him backwards, as a man drags a fighting dog. He had a grip of iron. The effect of the sudden pull on Ferrier was to make him lose his balance. He staggered against the side of the close, calling to Logie to desist. Archie still held on with backboneless tenacity, but as the scrape of flint and steel cut the darkness, he knew that he had carried his superfluous pleasantries too far. He dared not loose Ferrier's ankle and roll to the wall, lest the action should prove him to be more wide awake and less intoxicated than he seemed. He could only bury his face in his sleeve. His next sensation was a violent stab of burning pain in his wrist that made him draw it back with a groan. "I knew that would mend matters," said James grimly, as he blew out the tiny twist of ignited tow and replaced it and the steel box in his pocket. "Come away. This sot has wasted our time long enough. He can sleep off his liquor as well here as anywhere else." "You've helped to sober him," said Ferrier, as the two men went out of the close. Flemington sat up. The burn stung him dreadfully, for the saltpetre in which the tow had been dipped added to the smart. But there was no time to be lost, so he rose and followed again. Ferrier and Logie went off up the High Street and turned down an offshoot of it, which Archie guessed to be the New Wynd, because it answered to its position in his map of the town. He dashed to the corner and watched them by the one light which illuminated the narrow street till he could see them no longer. Then he flitted after them, a soft-footed shadow, and withdrew under a friendly stairhead, as he had done at the North Port. A little farther on he could distinguish the two ascending an outside stair to a squat building, and he heard the sound of their knuckles on wood. Another minute, and they were all admitted. The two captains were led into a small room in the back premises of the Happy Land by a slatternly-looking woman, who disappeared when she had given them a light. Pens and ink lay upon the table, and the smoke of lamps had blackened the ceiling. It was a wretched place, and the sound of rough voices came now and again from other parts of the house. James drew up a chair, and Ferrier also sat down, tossing the roll of paper to his companion. "A young man called Flemington is at Balnillo painting my brother's portrait," said Logie. "It's a pity that I have not something of his gift for drawing." "Flemington?" said the other. "There is a widow Flemington who lives a mile or so this side of the Perthshire border, but that is the only part of the country I do not know. This is her grandson. She lived at St. Germain, and her husband was with King James. He is a strange lad, a fine lad, too. My brother seems mightily taken up with him." "Where is your plan?" asked Ferrier. James took out a small pocket book and laid it on the table. Then he smoothed out the roll of paper, drew the points of the compass on it, and began to copy from the rough sketches and signs which covered the leaf of his little book. Ferrier watched him in silence. "I could not do that were it to save my life," he said at last. "I learned something campaigning by the walls of Danzig," replied James. Ferrier watched the growing of the hasty map with admiration. His own talents for organization and tactics had given this obscure landowner the position he held in the Prince's haphazard army, but the professional soldier was invaluable to him. He sat wondering how he could have got on without James. "See," said Logie, pushing the paper to him. "Here lies the Venture off Ferryden, at the south side of the river, and here is Inchbrayock Island. That English captain is a fool, or he would have landed some men there. You and I will land on it, Ferrier. And now," he went on, "the man is twice a fool, for, though he has taken the guns from the fort and put them on board one of the unrigged ships, he has left her beside the quay. This point that I have marked with a cross is where she is moored. It would be idle not to make use of such folly. Why, man, if we can carry through the work I have in my mind, we shall blow the Venture out of the water. 3 nights I have skulked round the harbour, and now I think that every close and every kennel that opens its mouth upon it is in my head. And the island is the key to everything." Logie's eyes shone in the dim room like the eyes of some animal watching in a cave. "We must get possession of the ship at the quayside," continued he. "Then we will take a couple of the town guns and land them on Inchbrayock. 100 men from Brechin should be sufficient." "It must be done at night," said the other. "At night," said James, getting up and putting his hands on the back of his chair. "And now, as soon as possible, we must go down to the harbour and look carefully at the position of everything." Ferrier stood up and stretched himself, as men so often will when they are turning over some unacknowledged intention. James took up the roll of paper, glanced at it, and threw it down again. "I see it as though it had come by inspiration," he cried. "I see that we have a blockhead to deal with, and when Heaven sends such an advantage to His Highness, it is not you nor I, Ferrier, who will balk its design. You will not hang back?" He looked at his friend as though he were ready to spring at him, but Ferrier went on with his own train of thought. He was a slower man than Logie, but if he lacked his fire, he lacked none of his resolution. "You are right," he said. "A man is a fool who leaves what he has captured on the farther side of the river, who thinks, having taken his enemy's guns from a fort, that he can let it stand empty. He has done these follies because he knows that there are no troops in Montrose." "Ay, but are there troops in Brechin?" burst out James. "There are troops in Brechin," repeated Ferrier slowly, "and they must be got quietly into the town. I wish there were not 8 miles of road between the two." "I have not forgotten that," said James, "and tonight I mean to remain here till daylight, and then return home by the side of the Basin. I will make my way along its shore and judge whether it be possible for you to bring your men by that route. If you can get them out of Brechin by the river bank, and so on along the side of the Esk, you will avoid the road, and I will be waiting for you at the fort." Logie had come round the little table and stood by his friend, waiting for him to speak. "I will go with you," said Ferrier. "We can part below Balnillo, and I too will go back to Brechin by the river. I must know every step before I attempt to bring them in the dark. There must be no delays when the time comes." James drew a long sigh of relief. He had never doubted his companion's zeal, but his heart had been on fire with the project he carried in it, and Ferrier's complete acceptance of it was balm to his spirit. He was a man who spared himself nothing, mentally or physically. He folded the roll of paper and gave it to Ferrier. "Keep it," said he. "Now we must go to the harbour." End of chapter 5.